Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm Paul, I'm with the Dicey Review, and tonight we're going to be learning how to play the game Fast Sloths, being released by Stronghold Games in the US. Fast Sloths comes with all of the components that you see here, including double-sided game boards and reference boards, 5 sloth boards that also come with 5 wooden sloth tokens and 45 wooden leaves in each player color, and 120 animal cards with the matching wooden discs for each animal species. To start, begin by placing the 2 double-sided game boards in the orientation shown. Then, each player places their sloth board and their sloth in front of themselves. For the player's first game, the rulebook recommends that you start with the following 6 animal species. Each deck of animal cards will always have 10 cards, and each set of cards will also have a different set of values. Make sure that each stack of cards is set up in ascending order from the lowest to the highest, so the lowest numbers will be on top and the highest numbers will be on the bottom. Place each stack of cards next to the game board within easy reach of all players. Then take the matching animal discs for each stack of cards and place them on the board in this setup. The starting setup is printed in the rulebook as well. Next, the players will place one of their leaves on each of the 9 tree spaces on the game board. Next, determine who the starting player will be. Then, beginning with the last sloth in playing order, and then in reverse order, each player will pick their starting tree. The player will place their sloth token onto one of the trees, take the leaf token from that space, and then place it in the first designated space for leaves on the top of their sloth board. Now the game is set up and players are ready to play. But before we get into the details of the rules, it's important to explore some basic game concepts. Fast Sloths is a pick up and deliver game, but sloths don't want to move themselves, so the players will always rely on the different animals on the board to move their sloth pieces for them. Players will have to collect and play animal cards matching the different discs on the game board to allow their pieces to move. Players will begin with access to lower valued animal cards. The cards will increase in value and the animals will become faster. But as players get to the bottom of the decks and draw the most valuable cards, the decks will then reset and the animals will slow down again. This pattern will repeat throughout the game. One other thing to note is that the game board shows 7 different landscape types: resorts, forests, hills, plains, mountains, rivers, and bridges. Different species of animals can only move across certain landscape types. The types of landscapes that animals can move across can be seen on the side of their card. So for instance, the crocodile can move across resort spaces, forest spaces, plain spaces, and water spaces. The crocodile can also move under bridges, as this is a water space, but we'll go into more detail about this later. The most important land feature to pay attention to for the sloths are the spaces that contain trees. Trees can be printed on resorts, forests, or plains. Finally, we want to briefly mention that your sloth board will give you an overview of your turn. Players will always look to the column underneath their farthest placed leaf. The first step of their turn is drawing 3 cards. Then they may move an animal tile. Finally, they would discard down to 7 cards. As players collect more leaves and place them farther and farther on their sloth board, their actions will get slightly worse towards the end of the game. For instance, when a player collects 7 leaves, they can only draw 2 cards, they then have to discard 1, and their hand limit is reduced to 4. As we mentioned a moment ago, on a player's turn, you take 3 steps. First, you must draw the indicated number of cards under your rightmost placed leaf from different animal stacks. This step is mandatory. You have to do it every turn. Next, players are allowed to move an animal pawn if they wish. And finally, on the 3rd step of your turn, you'll check your hand limit. If you only have 1 or 2 leaves collected, you'll be able to keep 7 cards at the end of every turn. But the more leaves you collect, the fewer cards you can keep at the end of each turn. Now that we've looked at a general overview of a turn, let's look at the first step of a player's turn, drawing cards from different animal stacks. When taking this step, players must draw cards from different animal stacks. You can never draw 2 cards from the same stack. And it's also important to note that players can never look at the cards below the top card. The top card is the only one that will be visible when you take turns. As players collect more and more of their leaves, they will have to discard cards after taking the draw step in their action. And as players collect more and more leaves, they'll be able to draw fewer cards, and then discard. Once again, your options get worse the more leaves you collect. So for instance, if they wanted to, the players could draw these two cards and then discard this card from their hand. When discarding a card, it always goes underneath the matching animal stack. The next step of a player's turn is playing cards to move an animal pawn. This step in a player's turn is optional. If you're choosing to play animal cards to move one of the animal pawns, there are a few things to remember. First, you can pick only one species of animal to play from your hand. So for instance, with this hand, I could play unicorn cards or donkey cards, but I couldn't play both. It's also important to note that you're not forced to play all of the cards of one species. You can play as many as you want. So for instance, if I chose to play donkeys, I could either play the 2, the 3, or both. It's up to me. So let's say that this player decided to play these donkey cards, and they decided to play both of them. They would lay these cards out, and then count up the amount of movement points that these cards give them. Then, the player could use their 5 movement points to move any one of the donkey tokens around the board. Since the white player started here, it would make most sense for them to move this donkey token. For every movement point played, an animal pawn can move 1 space. When moving, the animal pawn can move to any adjacent space that's connected to where they currently are. It's also important to note that at the beginning and at the end of their movement, an animal token can pick up and drop off a sloth token for free. So for instance, before this donkey moves, they could pick up a sloth token from the same space where they are, or an adjacent space. This donkey could pick up this player piece and then move 1, 2, 3 spaces and drop the sloth off on an adjacent space or on the same space for no extra movement points. After the sloth landed on this space, they would immediately collect the leaf and place it on their player board. As we just pointed out as well, players don't have to use all of their movement points when moving. It's also important to note that players can collect leaves on the go. For instance, after using 3 of their movement points, the player could then use their 4th and 5th movement point, collecting this leaf as they move. Then, at the end of their turn, the player could then drop this sloth onto an adjacent space of their choice. It's also important to note that animals can pick up or drop the sloth token on landscape types that they're not normally allowed to travel on. It is important to note, however, that sloths can never be dropped on river spaces or on mountain spaces. They can be carried across these landscape types by animals that can move through them or over them, but they never want to end their movement there. So for instance, if the unicorn were carrying the sloth, they could end their movement on a mountain space, since the unicorn can travel on mountains, but the sloth would have to be dropped off on a different land type. It's also important to note that animals can move through a space with other animals, but 2 animals can never end in the same space. There can always be more than 1 animal and sloth token in the same space, however. Any number of sloths can inhabit the same space as 1 animal token. And it's important to note that once the sloth is dropped, both the animal token and the sloth don't move anymore. The remaining movement points are lost. It's also important to note that if an animal is picking you up or dropping you off and they can't swim, they can only pick you up or drop you off on the 2 spaces that are directly adjacent to the bridge, or on the bridge itself. So for instance, even though this space is technically adjacent to this space, the unicorn wouldn't be able to pick up the sloth from this space because it's not connected to the bridge's entrance. And in a similar way, the unicorn couldn't drop the sloth off on this space if it were carrying it on the bridge, because this space isn't connected to the bridge's entrance. The unicorn could, however, drop the sloth in this space because there can be any number of sloth tokens in the same space as 1 animal pawn. After moving an animal pawn, matching the cards that you played, you'll discard those cards to the matching animal stack. When you discard multiple cards of the same type, you'll place them in ascending order, and then discard them face up underneath the matching animal stack. Now it's important to note that each animal type has specific landscapes that they can move through or move over. And it's also important to note that most of the animal cards have some kind of special ability or restriction that will alter their play. We'll go over each animal's landscape types, special powers, and restrictions in just a moment. Finally, after drawing cards and potentially playing animal cards to move an animal pawn, players would complete the third step of their turn, discarding down to their hand limit. As players collect more and more leaf tokens, their hand limit will shrink. If a player has more cards in their hand than allowed by their hand limit, they have to discard excess cards from their hand. Players can choose any card to discard and place them face up below the matching animal stacks. Once a player collects their 8th leaf, finish the turn, and then in clockwise order each other sloth will continue to play until each player has had the same number of turns. After this, the player with the most leaves will win the race. If there's a tie among the players for who has the most leaves, the tied player with the highest total of movement points in their hand would win the race. So in this instance, this player would win with 8 points of movement as opposed to this player's 7. And if there were to still be a tie, the victory would be shared. Now that we've looked at turn overviews and explained all the rules necessary for movement and taking turns, let's look at each individual animal card, their landscape types, and their special abilities. We'll start by looking at the 6 recommended starting species. Donkeys can move through resorts, forests, hills, and plains. It's important to note, however, that donkeys can't move across bridges, so this donkey pawn will have to stay in this area for the remainder of the game. Crocodiles have a special ability of always adding 1 movement point to the total cards that are played. So for instance, if the players played 8 total movement points for the crocodile, they would add 1 more and make it 9. It's important to note that it doesn't matter how many cards you play for the crocodile, you'll always only add 1 point of movement. And crocodiles can move on resorts, forests, plains, and water. It's important to note that since crocodiles can swim, they ignore the restrictions around bridges. But it's important to note that crocodiles cannot cross border spaces that don't touch water. So for instance, if the crocodile were right here, it wouldn't be able to move to this space because this border is not touching water. So for instance, in this situation, it would have to move here and then here. It's important to note that this would be a legal move for the crocodile because this border touches water and this border touches water. The unicorn is able to move through resorts, hills, plains, mountains, and cross bridges. The unicorn does have the restriction, however, that you can only play a single unicorn per turn. So even if you have 3 unicorn cards in hand, you can only play 1 at a time to move the unicorn. Elephants can move across plains, and they can move through water. Since the elephant can move through water, it ignores the restrictions of entering and leaving bridges. No matter how many elephant cards you play, you have to subtract 1 movement point from your movement point total when playing elephant cards. When dropping you, however, the elephant has a very special ability. It can fling you up to 3 spaces. It's important to note that elephants can't throw you over mountains, but they can throw you in a curved path. So for instance, if the purple player played these 4 elephant cards, they would reduce the movement total to 3. With those 3 movement points, the elephant could pick up the sloth, move 1, 2, 3 spaces, and then throw the sloth 3 spaces to land and collect the leaf. It's important to note that while the sloth is being thrown, it's technically in the air, so if it were to cross over any leaves while flying, it wouldn't be able to collect them on the go. You have to be on the ground to collect a leaf on the go. The eagle has a very special ability. It's like a taxi. If you play eagle movement cards, the eagle will come and pick you up, regardless of where you are on the board. Now it's important to note that unlike all the other animals, the eagle flies during its movement. And it's important to note that the eagle can fly across all landscape types. To utilize the eagle, you have to play at least 6 movement points to activate it. Then, no matter where the eagle disc is on the board, you can move the eagle to your space or to a space adjacent to you, even if there's another animal on that space. So for instance, if the white sloth played 6 points of movement for the eagle could come and land on this space here, even though there's an ant staying there. Then the eagle can pick you up and move up to 6 spaces. So for instance, this eagle could pick up the sloth and move 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 spaces and land adjacent to this tree. At this point, they could drop the sloth off and it would be able to collect its leaf. It's important to note that you can't collect leaves on the go if you're flying, just like when you're being thrown by the elephant. Next, let's look at the ants and how they move. Ants can move through resorts, forests, hills, plains, and across bridges. And ants are special. The ants first position themselves, and then they can move the sloths. So when playing ant cards for movement points, you can first use some of your movement points to position the ants into different chains, and then you can use any remaining movement points to move the sloth across a chain of ants. It costs 1 point of movement to move each ant one space, and then after the ants are positioned, it costs 1 point of movement to move a sloth token across one chain of ants. So let's use this example where a player has used 4 points of movement to move ants. The player could first move this ant 2 spaces to create one chain of ants. They now have 2 movement points remaining. And it's important to note that each chain of ants can pick you up and drop you off for free. So with the remaining 2 points of movement, this sloth could be picked up by this chain for free and then moved across the entire chain for 1 point and dropped off in this location. And for their second movement point, this sloth could be picked up by this smaller chain of ants and then dropped off on this location. Moving across this chain would use their final movement point. It's important to note that we've just covered the 6 animals that the game recommends that you start with. So you now know everything you need to know to play the introductory game. If you want to learn what the other animals do, we'll explain those now. Rabbits can only move through plains, but no matter how many rabbit cards you play, you will always add 2 points of movement to your movement point total. So for instance, with this player playing these 2 cards, gaining 4 points of movement, they would add 2 to that total for a total of 6 points. They could pick up this sloth and move 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 points to collect their leaf. The human can only move to different resorts. For every 3 movement points that you play, a human can move from one resort to another, regardless of the distance. The human disc can't stop between resorts, but they can pick up animals along the way. So for instance, if this player played these 6 movement points for the human, they could move to this resort for 3 movement points, pick up the sloth, and then move to the next resort for the remaining 3 points. The human can only drop sloths onto or next to a resort. The dolphin is the fastest animal in the game, but its movement is restricted to the river. The dolphin can move through the river and ignore the restrictions of entering and leaving bridges. It's important to note, however, that since all tree spaces are on the land, you can't collect a leaf on the go while being carried by a dolphin. If a player used these 6 movement points, however, they could pick up the sloth here, move 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then drop the sloth off, losing the remaining movement point. Giraffes have the ability to move through plains and rivers, so this animal also ignores the restrictions of entering and leaving bridges. The giraffe has a long neck that enables it to pick up and drop off up to 2 spaces away. It's important to note that the giraffe can do this anywhere between its own space and up to 2 spaces away. So for instance, if the giraffe were right here, it could pick up this sloth, or even if the sloth were right there, it could pick it up from that space as well. It's also important to note that the giraffe could pick up the sloth even at this curved angle. And it's important to note that the giraffe can't pick you up or drop you off across mountains. And if the giraffe lifts you across a tree space, you can't collect your leaf. You can only collect your leaf if you're being dropped by the giraffe on that space. Mountain goats can move through resorts, forests, hills, plains, and mountains. It can also move across bridges to cross the rivers. The mountain goat has the special ability that it can move through mountain ranges for 0 movement. So for instance, in this example, the player could first pick up the sloth, then enter these mountains and move to the rightmost mountain space for no movement points. They would then have to use a movement point to exit the mountain, so they could go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and drop the character off here. And finally, let's look at the orangutans. The orangutans have strong arms, and they can throw you across distances. Orangutans can move through forests and hill spaces. Similar to the ants, you will first use movement points to move the orangutans. After moving and positioning the orangutans how you want, they can then pick you up and throw you across distances. For 1 movement point, you can move each orangutan disc 1 space. So let's say, for instance, that this player played 7 points. They could then use one of those points to move this orangutan to this space. They could pick up this sloth for free, and then for 2 movement points each, the orangutan can throw you up to 3 spaces. For their second and third movement point, they could throw this sloth up to 3 spaces away to the next orangutan. For the 4th and 5th movement point, they could throw this sloth again, up to 3 spaces away to the next orangutan. And finally, for their 6th and 7th movement point, they could throw this sloth to the tree space and collect the leaf. It's important to note that an orangutan can't throw you across a mountain, but it can throw you like a curveball. If you fly across a tree space, you can't collect your leaf. You can only collect your leaf if you're dropped on a space. Alright everyone, that was our video. We hope that it was helpful and we hope that it was informative. If you still have any questions about how to play the game, please comment below or email us directly at thediceyreview@gmail.com. If you want to read any of our written reviews, you can visit thediceyreview.com and make sure and connect with us on social media or by visiting our Board Game Geek Guild. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, we'll see you at the table.